Kia ora koutou. Ko Collin Bjork toko ingoa no Texas o Kufano ke tenoho o ki Papaioia. No mai haere mai ki te tene hui on the topic of AI and the environment. We have two distinguished speakers today, Professor Christine Parker and Dr. Cy Taffel, who will each present for 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But before I introduce their bios, even though many of you know them already, I want to just remind everyone that this talk today is part of a much longer speaker series celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Political Ecology Research Center here at Massey University, which is a pretty exciting thing. Cy is one of the co-directors of PERC, as we call it, Political Ecology Research Center here. And I'm going to put a link after I get done with my introduction. I'll put a link into the chat of the upcoming talks so that you can plop those into your diary. It's basically every fortnight on a Wednesday for more or less the rest of the year. A lot of really interesting and provocative talks coming your way. This is the second one. So something to look forward to. Brief bios. So let's see here. Cy Taffel, who will be speaking first, is a senior lecturer in media studies and co-director of the Political Ecology Research Center here at Massey in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Cy's research focuses on the ecological, material, cultural, and political affordances of digital technologies. His current research project explores the intersections between digital technologies and post-growth futures. He is the author of, write these down if you want to spend a little reading time here, Digital Media Ecologies, one book, editor of Plastic Legacies, and the third one, Ecological Entanglement in the Anthropocene. That's Cy Taffel. And Christine, I'll introduce now as well. Christine Parker is a professor of law at Melbourne Law School, the University of Melbourne, and chief investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. Professor Parker has a long career teaching and researching on lawyers' ethics, regulatory studies, and corporate accountability. Her socio-legal research has made important empirical, conceptual, and policy contributions to the politics, ethics, and democratic governance of regulation in a range of areas, including competition and consumer protection law, the food system, the legal profession, environmental and health and safety regulation, and more recently, the social and ecological regulation of the digital economy, which we might hear about later today. Now, her books that you might want to write down, Professor Parker's books include The Open Corporation, Business Self-Regulation and Democracy. Second, Explaining Compliance, Business Responses to Regulation, and the third one, an influential social critique and text called Inside Lawyers' Ethics. So you have a little homework, a little reading opportunities there for you guys. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Cy to begin the conversation here about AI and the environment. Thanks, Cy.
And hopefully you can see my screen now. Kia ora ko Cy Taffel toku ingoa. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Collin. I'm Cy. I'm, like Collin, based here at Te Papaioia, Palmerston North, on land that was traditionally stewarded by Rangitane o Manawatu. And Christine and I are going to be talking a bit about the environmental impacts of AI. And I guess what I'd say is I'm going to try and do some kind of foundational work thinking about what do we mean when we're talking about AI, thinking about a few ways of defining it, and then thinking in broad brush terms about what some of the environmental impacts associated with AI might be. And then hopefully Christine is going to build on that in the second half of this. The image that I've got as the background for this opening slide is something that some of you may have seen in the news in the last couple of months. It's a thermal image of an XAI data center in Tennessee. The red blobs on there are patches of heat from 35 methane gas turbines that reportedly use a similar amount of power as you would need for about 280,000 American homes. Now, local residents here complained that the particle pollution associated with this has either caused or worsened respiratory health conditions, and that they've effectively become a sacrifice zone for this XAI data center. So I thought this was a good image to get us to start thinking about some of these environmental impacts. But to back up a little bit and start off by saying, when we're talking about AI, what is it that we're talking about? Um, I'm going to talk about a few definitions, and the first is going to be what we normally encounter. So this is a slide that I've pulled from an NVIDIA blog post, like what is AI? And it's the most common definition we have, which is that there's this thing called artificial intelligence, which has been a paradigm in computer science for 70 odd years now, which is about the kind of simulation or emulation of decision making or human thought. There's a subfield of AI called machine learning that kind of has been around since about the 1980s. And machine learning systems are where you have an algorithm that is trained to find statistical patterns within a training data set. And the idea is that once it's learned those patterns, it can then apply that to other data sets. And this is really widely used. There's kind of a subfield of machine learning around artificial neural networks, and a subset of that around deep learning, which is multi-layered artificial neural networks where there's backwards propagation. So information moves forwards and backwards. And deep learning is where a lot of the kind of breakthroughs around AI from about the 2010 exists. But when we deal with AI systems today, they're often machine learning systems. Some of them use deep learning methods. Some of them also still have some of the top-down kind of expert rules that we associate with earlier AI. And that vagueness is something that speaks to the amount of hype around AI as a discourse at the moment. But I wanted to flag that this conventional definition that we have is one that is quite technical and quite abstract. And so a couple of other ways of thinking about what AI is. One is to give you a more kind of materialist definition, to try and think about some of the technologies and spaces that are needed for all this computation to occur. So going from kind of small to big, on the top left here, we've got an image of an NVIDIA GPU. So unlike the CPUs that we have in our kind of laptop or desktop computers that have a small number of cores that mainly do sequential information processing, GPUs, which started off in graphics card and now are used for AI, have a very large number of cores that are focused on parallel processing. Contemporary GPUs have single nanometer transistor process designs. They're almost all produced using a process called extreme ultraviolet lithography. The machines that make these chips are only produced by one company, ASML, and then most of the actual fabrication takes place with a company called TSMC, who are based in Taiwan. These specific chips find their way into AI servers. So the top right image here is an NVIDIA AI server, which contains 8 of those GPUs with over 1 terabyte of GPU memory, a couple of server class CPUs, and a large amount of superfast storage. And then you get data centers, which are these kind of enormous warehouses or factories that are filled with racks that are stuffed with servers and associated networking equipment. So hyperscale data centers, which is where the data center industry has been going for over a decade, have at least 5,000 of these server devices in them. The biggest of these data centers now are more like 500,000 servers in them. They're absolutely gargantuan. And to try and illustrate this, the bottom right image there is an under construction OpenAI data center in Texas. The size of that construction site is about 875 acres. And once it is all up and running, it's expected to use around 1.2 gigawatts of electricity, which is enough for somewhere between 3/4 and 1 million American homes. Now, a third way of trying to think about what AI is, and I think it's useful to have these three together rather than saying one of them is the correct way of thinking about AI, is to think about social definitions, like what kind of political, cultural, and intellectual environments are involved in these technosocial assemblages. And I've got a few quotes from kind of critical thinkers who do work around AI. Dan McQuillan argues AI is always more than a set of machine learning methods. When we're thinking about the actuality of AI, we can't separate the calculations and code from the social context of its application. Matteo Pasquinelli argues that AI is a project to capture the knowledge expressed through individual and collective behavior and encode it into algorithmic models to automate diverse tasks from image recognition and object manipulation to language translation and decision making. And so he's interested here in how AI is less about simulating biological intelligence so much as it represents the corporate capture of various forms of labor and social relations. Kate Crawford, in her book Atlas of AI, argues that contemporary forms of artificial intelligence are neither artificial nor intelligent. That AI depends on layers of exploitation, including the extraction of mass unpaid labor. When we think about the generation of all of that data that is used to train these algorithms, but also large amounts of heavily exploited, poorly paid labor when we think about the work that is done labeling, supervising, and fine-tuning these corporate systems. And the last one I've got here is from Ali Al-Khatib, who argues that we should shed the idea that AI is a technological artifact with political features and recognize it as a political artifact through and through. AI is an ideological project to shift authority and autonomy away from individuals towards centralized structures of power. And I think noting that centralization of economic and political power around AI is quite useful. I would say in some ways it does kind of empower certain groups of individuals who are largely kind of privileged entrepreneurial subjects, but I would absolutely agree that they are then channeled through these multi-billion or increasingly multi-trillion dollar tech corporations in order to be able to exert the agency there. So it's not a case when we're thinking of AI that we have what we commonly encounter, which is like it's humans versus machines. It's a case of thinking about the different distributions of human and machine agencies within technosocial assemblages. So that's kind of three ways of trying to define AI. To move on and think a bit about the environmental costs or harms or impacts that are associated with these technologies. And I just wanted to note that from this point onwards, this presentation is going to have a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs. And often the numbers are based on estimates. And in part, that's because the corporations they're associated with aren't particularly transparent about many particular processes. And when they do present things, it tends to be in heavily greenwashed promotional materials and environmental reports. But while I'm not necessarily super confident in a lot of the specific numbers, I think the trends that they speak to are things that we really need to pay attention to. So this first graph shows what is often kind of taken as the beginning and end of the environmental cost of AI. It speaks to the energy cost of training those machine learning based models. And while you might look at that line and say, well, that doesn't look particularly steep, this is a logarithmic scale, right? So this represents from 2015 to 2025 an increase of around 2,000 times in the amount of energy that is used to train frontier AI models, from about $5,000 to over 10 million. If that continued at this pace for the next decade, we'd be talking about training a model requiring 20 trillion US dollars worth of energy. And so you can kind of see where this concern comes from. This is the kind of same data, but shown in a different way. The IEA graph on International Energy Association numbers on the left around training compute is a linear scale, so we can see that exponential trajectory far more clearly. And on the right is stuff that's taken from a Stanford University AI report and trying to visualize the data to show the growth in the AI training costs. However, when we're thinking about these systems, you've got the training costs at the beginning, but then you've also got the inference costs, actually running the systems in practice. And whereas you train the algorithm at the beginning, the inference costs can actually end up being higher if the model runs for a long time and it's really popular. So the estimates for inference vary quite a lot. There are some credible bits of information from people like Nvidia and Amazon that say it can be up to 80 or 90% of the whole electricity cost associated with the AI is not the training, it's running it. Other costs are more like 50-50, but it really depends on both how popular the usage of the system is and also how long it runs for before it's replaced by a newer, more energetically intensive model. Also wanted to note that what the AI system does is also really important in thinking about its energy costs. It's not all AI is equal, and that should be obvious to us insofar as, like, our phones do a bunch of AI related stuff, but obviously that doesn't use a huge amount of energy if you're doing it on the device because you've only got a little battery in them. This is a graph that's taken from a paper from Ligazat and De Vries last year. And again, note it's a logarithmic scale. So you're going from text classification being like 100th of a gram of CO2 emitted per token to AI image generation being several hundred grams of greenhouse gases per image being generated. This doesn't have video generation on there. And remember, like, video is between 24 and 60 discrete images per second. So the costs of video generation are way higher than the things that we have on here. So we put together the electricity costs around inference and training, and there's a significant concern around the amount of electricity that is needed for data centers. Now, not all data center usage is AI, but most of the growth that we're seeing at the moment is AI related. So this is another IEA figure, which suggests that when you look at the amount of construction of new hyperscale data centers that are coming online, by the end of the decade, we will have more than doubled the global use of data center electricity to the point that will be round about the 1,000 terawatt hours per year mark. To try and give like some context for that, if you were comparing it to nation states, by the end of the decade, that would be roughly the amount of electricity that Japan uses today. But obviously that's kind of over 100 million people. It's their lighting, it's powering their IT, their health services, their schools, and the heavily robotized factories for Toyota and Nissan and Sony and Canon and other major global brands. So this is a really significant amount of electricity, and this is why there's been so much focus in this area. Still, when we're just focused on the energy costs of AI, we should remember that it's not just the use in the data centers. These things require energy to produce in the first place. The racks, the cooling equipment, the buildings themselves, and the associated infrastructure around them all have costs in terms of carbon footprints. This is data for a conventional rather than an AI server because it's really hard to get this kind of data for AI servers. But what we can see is that while most of the energy is in use, because stuff in data centers runs 24/7, often at load, especially if it's used for training AI, which is quite different from consumer devices where often 80% of lifetime costs are producing things in the first place. We should still note that in this case, producing one HP server is 2.5 tons of greenhouse gases. So when you're talking about facilities with hundreds of thousands of these, you're talking about pretty immense impacts. To kind of try and illustrate some of that, TSMC, the major manufacturer of just the chips for the GPUs, used about 9% of the whole of Taiwan's electricity in 2023, and only 6% of that electricity comes from renewable sources. So when we're talking about all of this stuff around energy, we're really focusing on the climate crisis and the amount of energy that is being added to what we already use. And it's worth noting that while we've known that climate change is a really pressing threat to continued human flourishing since about 1990, Over that 35-year period, we have seen enormous increases in the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that are used globally. As this chart for global primary energy shows, like, yes, solar and wind are ramping up, but their ramp up doesn't even cover the increase in energy that we're currently consuming globally at the moment. And if we're going to come anywhere near hitting globally agreed climate targets, we need to rapidly be decarbonizing, which means reducing our use of fossil fuels. And really, it's hard to imagine how that is going to correlate with using enormous amounts of additional energy for producing, training, and running AI systems. But we should note that when we're talking about environmental impacts and ecological crises, while climate change gets most of the press, it's not the only problem. I imagine most of you are familiar with this planetary boundaries framework that comes out the Stockholm Resilience Centre. By 2023, when they had quantified each of the 9 boundaries that were set, they found that globally we've not just exceeded climate change, but also biosphere integrity, which is the biodiversity crisis, land system change, freshwater change, biogeochemical flows, so disruptions to the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, and novel entities, which are things like plastic pollution, PFAS, and other like new industrial pollutants. And again, here, when we think about AI, there are a bunch of areas where AI systems contribute to these other harms, beginning, of course, with the extraction industries themselves. So getting all of the stuff that is needed for GPUs, for servers, for data centers, and the other infrastructure for this stuff. This is an image of an open pit copper mine. Obviously, like, whatever ecosystem that was here before effectively isn't. It's an ecological dead zone. And this is why the United Nations Environment Programme often cites the extraction industries as being like one of the major drivers of the biodiversity crisis, the 6th mass extinction of life on the planet. Equally, we could look at AI and PFAS. So PFAS are a group of substances that are commonly referred to as forever chemicals. They're persistent organic pollutants that can take hundreds or thousands of years to break down. They're associated with a broad number of harms to human and animal life. They're carcinogenic, they're immunotoxins, they're endocrine disruptors, they impair fertility, and they decrease liver and kidney function, amongst other things. And in some ways, they're kind of chemically interesting substances insofar as they challenge the dominant logic of toxicology, the idea that the dose makes the poison, and that the job of toxicology is to say, well, what's a safe level for exposure? Because despite PFAS leading to increased sensitivity in measurement, which is geared towards quantifying parts per trillion, there has not been a safe threshold under which exposure levels are considered to not be harmful. Any exposure to this stuff creates harm. And the microelectronics industry is the second largest industrial user of PFAS, and it's the largest user of the most harmful classes of non-polymer based PFAS. Now, an EU study from 2023 found 77 different uses of these chemicals in microelectronics production, and they're particularly important and used in particularly large volumes when it comes to producing semiconductors using extreme ultraviolet lithography, the process that's used to make all of those high performance AI chips where we see ASML, TSMC, and NVIDIA monopolizing different areas of the production process. Now, as well as thinking about those kind of like planetary level issues, there are also local problems when it comes to AI in the environment. Obviously, the extraction industries feeds into a bunch of those, but I also just briefly wanted to flag that water use is another issue associated with data centers. They use billions of gallons of water a year, and that's basically to do the cooling, because you have all this electrical equipment which uses all this power, which generates lots of heat. So you need to cool the data centers to protect those delicate and sensitive microelectronic components. So the issue here is not that there's a big number in terms of overall water being used. The problem is that many data centers and data center clusters exist in places where you've got already stressed watersheds, which is only being exacerbated by the climate crisis. And so this effectively puts multi-billion-dollar tech corporations into competition for scarce water resources with far less economically powerful actors, including in many places of the world, subsistence farmers and indigenous people. So to try and wrap up really quickly, if we go beyond the specific harms around electricity or energy or materials or water or land, what kind of logics underpin a whole swathe of those problems? And the first of those for me is a vector of exponential growth. Now, this is something that we find in various ecological systems, but only as like a short-term temporary thing that is then followed by stabilization or exponential decay. And generally, we don't want that kind of crash to happen if we're trying to think about sustainability. But we should also note that while exponential growth is associated with AI and with digital technology, compound growth is also something that really underpins capitalism as an economic mode of production. And similarly, the second logic that I think underpins a lot of this is an extractive one. So AI kind of has an extractive relationship to land, to matter, to water, to materials, to energy, to data. Like Collin has done really interesting work around AI's extractive relation to voice as well. And again, like the question that I just wanted to finish on is the problem here AI, or do we need to be thinking about broader, like socio-technical structures and economic structures where exponential growth and extractivism are kind of the dominant logics that we have? And on that point, I will stop and hand over to Christine.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sai. That sets up what I want to talk about beautifully. I'm really happy to have been invited to talk alongside you because I admire your work so much. So let me just share my screen and put it on. Yeah. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. All right. So first, I just want to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and with the beautiful living river, the Birrarung, flowing through and giving us life. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to talk through some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues here at the ADMS on the ecological impact of AI. And I want to acknowledge that I'm working with others on this work. Particularly at the moment, I'm working with Lena Przezadetsky, Sonia Kadir, and Michael Richardson on some work that's in progress. And what I'm going to say today is going to draw from two papers that have been published earlier this year, one led by Lou Sellard and one by Théo Lenoir, both in France. So you'll see there's a little bit of French field work in here in a moment. So I'm a socio-legal scholar of regulation and governance. So one of the things I'm interested in is how the problematization of the multifarious environmental entanglement of AI, and so just beautifully laid it all out, probably overwhelming. So how is this diverse distributed ecological impact of AI playing out in regulatory governance discourses? And what does this mean in terms of legitimating the dominant trajectories of AI? So for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, by regulatory governance, I mean both what you might think of as public policy. So, for example, the sort of policy discourse that ultimately led to the EU's AI Act, the biggest AI regulation at the moment. But I'm also talking about industry and corporate policies and commitments, so self-regulatory commitments, industry standards, and so on. And so drawing on those two papers I mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to talk a little bit about the quantification and standardization in relation to AI's environmental impacts in these regulatory governance spaces, which in one paper we relate to pharmacon thinking inspired by Bernard Stiegler, which we argue narrows the scope of discourses around AI's impact through quantification and standardization, with a particular focus on carbon accounting for the energy impact. And I'm also going to delve into the challenges faced by those who would be change makers in having to engage in this type of quantification, or what we refer to following Isabella Bruno as stat activism. And basically the big argument is that these dynamics or logics tend to end up privileging market-based policy responses. So I'll explain what I mean by that as I go along. So just to start with the pharmacon idea, I think this is now the dominant narrative. You could find it anywhere, but the example I'm giving you today is a recent statement from the World Economic Forum, so sort of the powerhouse of industry. And they write on a recent web page, with AI having a significant impact on energy and water consumption as well as global greenhouse gas emissions, it's vital that the subject of environmental sustainability is included in the sort of responsible AI discourse. But they always go on to put the other side of the pharmacon, so the poison and the remedy idea. Simultaneously, there's an undeniable sense of renewed hope that AI can positively contribute to the global transition to a lower carbon economy. And typically that's related to things like smart grids, mobility, making the cars and the transport and so on move around more efficiently, and climate modeling and so on, to understand what's happening better. And if you go and look at that webpage, you'll see that they go on to call on companies to inventory their AI emissions and to work to improve efficiency, because we need this AI to solve the climate crisis, but we need to make sure it's as efficient as possible. And they cite the green energy commitments that have been made by some of the big tech companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and OpenAI. So just stepping back from that for a moment, how did that happen? How did it come to be that the World Economic Forum is worrying about the environmental impact of AI? So in the paper, we trace this back to a particular moment at the end of 2019, which I think is instructive. So obviously academics and environmental nerds like Cy have been researching and writing and acting on the environmental impact of digital technology for a long time. And I know that's been there, but how did it become a public issue, something that became to public consciousness and forced big tech companies like Amazon and Google and so on to make climate and other environmental commitments? Because what we argue is that up until about late 2019, there was this sort of idea that big tech companies, Cy's written about this as well, that the big tech is kind of dematerial, it's kind of green by default, and that therefore we didn't really need to worry so much about the environmental impact of big tech. In our paper, we write about how around the end of 2019, coming from within the tech industry itself, some of the professional employees like software engineers started joining with the more radical labour rights groups within the tech companies in the Tech Won't Build It campaign, which was all about protesting the provisioning of AI to military and security provisioning by the first Trump government. And as the UN Climate Summit was coming up in New York at the end of 2019, and you'll remember the Friday climate strikes and so on, this Tech Won't Build It campaign joined the climate strikes, realizing that the years of inaction on climate needed radical justice action, and that big tech was part of the problem. And what I want to point out is the radical multiple justice-oriented demands that are summarized in those 4 graphics that are there on the slide, where they're contesting the use of AI to help fossil fuel companies more efficiently extract more oil and gas from more hard to reach places like the ocean, the way that algorithmic recommender systems in social media were helping to fund climate denialism, and the way that the surveillance and military applications that they were already protesting were intersecting with the way that climate crisis would be displacing people. So it's quite a radical justice-oriented protest. But what this leads to is a need to sort of tame these multifarious demands with doable, measurable corporate environmental commitments. So what we trace in that paper is the way that, well, just a few months before the climate strikes, Emma Struble and colleagues had actually presented what I think was the first paper seeking to quantify the financial and environmental cost of running neural network models for natural language processing, so the modern AI. And you can see the report there from MIT Review, finding that training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetimes. The actual measure is not important. Si's given you a whole lot of other quantifications. But the point was that this marked the genesis of quantification of the carbon footprint of machine learning, and the emergence of a small community of tech workers and engineers working on the greening of AI and focused on best practices to develop less energy demanding AI models and reduction of storage of data. So now we see quite a flourishing of communities of practice across industry and policy, such as the Green Software Foundation, and there's a graphic from them in the bottom right corner there, who are trying to come up with ways to quantify, measure, stick it into the software so that procurers of AI-enabled software and even consumers can see where the energy is coming from, how much energy is being consumed, and make the more sustainable choice. And at the same time, we also see some of the big AI civil society or NGO groups constantly engaging in this space, but also constantly sort of needing to remind the companies and prompt the workers to keep expanding the categories of what's being measured, as I just explained, as across the whole life cycle and the whole disparate range of ways that AI has an environmental impact. Now, this has borne fruit in the sense that the environmental impact of AI has been recognised in policy developments. So the final version of the EU AI Act does include some reference to environmental protection as part of its objects. So originally it didn't have any mention of the environment. It was concerned with human-centric, trustworthy AI. So basically the EU AI Act is trying to figure out how to do risk assessment of general purpose AI in order that it can keep rolling out and we can trust it. And all this sort of activity and activism led to the environment getting a mention in there. So it's included as part of the health, safety and fundamental rights, the protection of health, safety and fundamental rights that's seen as an object of the AI Act. But the way that this actually gets cashed out in practice is that then it becomes an obligation on the AI developers to engage in risk assessment and management of the whole range of potential health, safety and fundamental rights impacts. And the way that that gets cashed out is through technical, voluntary, co-regulatory standards. So there's a call out already, or there's work being done on a standard for measuring the environmental impact of AI with a big focus on carbon accounting. Probably one of the most interesting things that's happened in the space is that the French environmental minister asked the French standardization organization to already come up with a standard as the AI Act was going through. And I think the idea was that they wanted to get in first and be the ones to kind of define what it might be. And you can see the graphic for that there in purple in the middle. They ended up having a big debate then about, well, should it just be about efficiency and carbon accounting, or should it be about more than that? And so their standard is actually called the Frugal AI standard. So they expanded the categories and said, well, we should be looking at how the AI is actually being used. I'll talk more about that in a moment. I know I don't have much time. And then on the right, you see there at the same time, we've got the various AI companies, developer companies. Some of them, some of the newer, smaller ones are sort of competing on the idea that they're being transparent about their environmental impact, or more transparent than what some of the other big tech companies are. So this is one of the leading ones. Sasha Lucioni from Hugging Face has worked really hard on measuring the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions of various types of energy being used in Hugging Face's AI models, Bloom and Small. And she's done some really interesting work. But this all has, so what's the impact of this? So I guess because this is the area that I've looked at in relation to, I think at the beginning, Collin listed off a whole lot of areas where I've done work, and it sort of always seems to end up the same way, in the way that our, for want of a better word, neoliberal policy environment plays out, that we end up in this situation that privileges industry-led, market-based action. So the policy discourse ends up becoming one in which we have this demand for what seems to be accountability by the industry, but turns into a demand for them to measure their impact and make transparent those measures, which then puts the burden of making an informed choice onto the consumer, or in this case, it might be the procurer in other companies and government agencies who are buying the products, the AI-enabled software products. And this privileges industry-based measures, particularly in the tech industry, because these AI models are so opaque, so black-boxed. that it needs to come from within. It privileges technical standards, and so this ends up privileging this sort of self-regulatory, co-regulatory, market-based action. This call for measurement also always ends up flattening and narrowing the scope of what is being discussed in policy and practice, because we have to find something to measure. And the range of localities, differentials of geography, the distributed nature of the environmental entanglement of these whole AI systems or infrastructures gets lost as we have to lump and average things into measures. And it also enables creative accounting and greenwashing, because as these things get lumped into measures, we can plus and minus things from each other. So on the left there, you see some Guardian reporting about how some of the big tech companies have been using renewable energy certificates, which is sort of like, and carbon offsets and so on, to in the way that they report their emissions, and it's making the total estimates contestable. On that other part from the OECD, you see sort of an attempt to figure out all the things that should be measured, but you see as it, from this expert group, which was quite influential, but you see as it flows through into policy, we lose a lot of those measures and end up just looking at energy consumption. So I think I should just try and finish up pretty quickly. What I want to point out is that this dynamic is a genuine response by people trying to make change by using numbers. And if you have a look at those first, this is from the interviews that Teo did and that we analysed in our paper on stat activism. And if you just look at those first two quotes, you see the tension that's at work here. So on the one hand, the first person at a big tech company is saying, look, we need the number, because as long as we don't have any numbers, then the assumption is that the number's zero, i.e. there's no impact. So as long as we've got a number, then the number's not zero, and that creates some friction, which makes us think about the environmental impact. Whereas the second person is saying, yeah, but then there's this idea that companies won't act until they've measured everything. And we know from other environmental issues how this need to measure things becomes a reason for delay and inaction. So finally, I just want to show you, this is the, actually, I'll not show you that bit first. This is Mistral AI. They're a French AI company, and they're the first company to have used the French standard, which is a bit more all-encompassing than some of the other measures. And they've put out this these graphics. This has just come out recently. But you see, even when they're trying to be more holistic about everything that they cover, we still end up with this situation where things get flattened into just a few measures. And you see right down the bottom there, number 7, those downstream enabled impacts. That was the thing that was totally at issue in the creation of the French standard, and yet they've just put not applicable on that because they're a general AI producer, so they don't know how people are using it and what the enabled impacts are. And it ends up getting put into this sort of graphic. It always seems to end up getting then directed to you as a consumer. It becomes your responsibility then. So if you use our Gen A model to generate 1 page of text, then this is the damage that you're doing. And so the burden has got shifted to preaching to the consumer rather than asking the big questions about this whole system. So I think, so it tends to end up reproducing the existing power structures with perhaps some marginal efficiency improvements, and putting the burden on us as consumers, also those of us who care about the environmental impact of industry, including the tech industry, to have to keep contesting these categorizations and the scope of what's being measured and the fact that it's not made transparent. And I want to finish by saying, I think the pharmacon sort of idea that AI is something that can be both beneficial and a problem at the same time is a logic that distracts attention from the way that AI is this distributed, entangled system. It tends to imply that AI has an impact, positive and negative, rather than that AI is a system that's through everything that we're doing, and that therefore the governance challenge is contesting and changing the rules of the game at every scale, everywhere, in all those localities. So I will stop my share, and hopefully we've got some time for questions or discussion.
Kia ora. Thank you for that, Christine. Thank you, Sai. Bravo. Yes, applause is coming through. I can see the digital applause. We're going to open it up for questions now. If you could please use the digital reaction hand wavy things, because there's actually quite a few people in the room, which is terrific. We have quite a crowd. It'll be easier for me to see your digital hands than it will be to see your material hands. While people are thinking up questions, I'll just say thanks for those really provocative graphs and charts from both of you. The Mistral chart was fascinating, Christine. Sai, I appreciate seeing those visuals and distinguishing the logarithmic growth curves. And I appreciate how both of you are talking about the underlying logics and ideologies that underpin these AI's impact on the environment. Questions? Can I propose an initial one while people continue to think? I'd be curious to know, Christine, so New Zealand just circulated an AI policy, and Sai, I'd be curious to hear your input on this. Basically, our conservative government said a bunch of nothing in this New Zealand policy. They said, look, we want everyone to adopt AI very quickly, but we're not going to really invest anything other than our existing investments. And we're also not going to regulate any more than our existing regulations because we believe those are satisfactory, even though there have been critiques of big tech for a long time in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm curious, Christine, what is Australia doing in this policy space? And Sai, if you have any comment on New Zealand's recent policy. Then I see a question in the chat, so I'll let you guys answer first.
Yeah, just to say that Australia was moving towards this mandatory guardrails approach, which it says mandatory guardrails for AI, but it probably wasn't actually going to be mandatory. It was more like a best practice, which is sort of a set of principles, which is a very light version, I guess, of the sort of requirement to assess risks and prove that you've done that. But even that, we've just had a productivity commission report saying, oh no, but we need to move fast on AI and we don't want to slow everything down by regulating AI. So we sort of, at the moment, we're in that space where regulation is red tape is bad. But I guess what that does in reality is that we know that at the same time, the demands for carbon accounting and so on are there to stay and have been ramped up. We could have a lot of critique of how they work. Yes, it's good that we've got it, but it's basically an industry-led, very quantified thing. So that will be there. That I don't think we can get rid of that. That's going to apply to everything, including AI. That's the short answer.
And I guess, like, on a similar note, when you think about our current right-wing coalition government in Aotearoa, they aren't really interested in taking environmental action in an effective way across a broad swathe of areas. So we shouldn't be surprised that AI is just another one of those. And they are, again, like, really enthusiastic about what using like foreign corporate owned AI systems might do in terms of enabling economic growth and pulling us out of a recession and enabling some of their reforms. So I think it's probably worth noting they've kind of said that the NCEA replacement, so changing the education system in Aotearoa, is going to heavily rely upon AI to do a bunch of the like design and marking for our overworked, like burnt out, currently striking teachers that the government is proposing to give a below inflation pay change to for the next 3 years. And like thinking about AI and regulation, I think has been quite interesting as well in many places in terms of how, like, copyright for a long time, when it benefited record companies and motion picture companies, was seen as like this really like sacred law that no one could break. And if like teenagers downloaded a couple of movies and CDs, that was a really terrible thing. But more recently, we've got the US and the UK and other places trying to very quickly draft laws to say, but if you've got trillion-dollar corporations stealing everything they can get their hands on the internet, that should be okay. And again, like, it speaks to the kind of entanglement between regulation and power, and the really unfortunate fact that while we have these major ecological crises to deal with, we have some pretty abysmal governments in place in many parts of the world at the moment.
Kia ora, thank you for that, Sai. I'm going to direct us to one question in the chat from Theo, and then we'll go to Warwick and Russell. Theo asks if either of you have any comments on the extreme fragility of the chips and the GPU's fabrication chain, right? It's production in Taiwan and elsewhere. Do either of you want to comment on that before we move to the second question?
I mean, I think probably just recognizing that, yes, it absolutely is a concern. I mean, of course, Taiwan-China relations are things that periodically flare up. And with some of the China-US stuff recently, so it wasn't really focused on AI stuff so much as rare earths, which are the lanthanides, which are like a little subset of the periodic table that no one probably knows that much about or cared that much about until they realized that they're essential for all kinds of like permanent magnets that are used in hard disks, that are used in wind turbines, that are used in electric motors, in all kinds of green technology. And about 2/3 of them are mined in China, but about 90% of them are refined in China. So most of the rare earths that aren't mined in China still have to go to China to be kind of separated and purified and processed into something that can actually be used by other industries. And so when Donald Trump was saying we're going to put 100+% tariffs on anything that comes over from China, one of the responses to that was, well, we're basically going to stop exporting this stuff that you need for all of your like green and digital tech. And that was one of the things that put a bit of a break on some of those American ambitions to have enormous tariffs against China. So yes, we absolutely should recognize the fragility and precarity of some of those globalized supply chains.
Thank you. I'm going to just mark that it's 1 o'clock so we understand if people need to leave, but we'll go ahead and take these last two questions from Warwick and Russell. And if you can stay around and hear, go for it. We'll be here for these questions. Warwick, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sai and Christine. A question for Christine. I'm wanting to pick your socio-legal thought. You talked about the dilemma that pharmacon produces, this kind of state of disavowal that just takes thought into a black hole. I'm wondering, from your perspective, is there anything about law as a discursive formation that may be able to cut through that And I'm thinking about those instances where AI will be seen to have, or an AI agent will have been seen to cause harm. A plane might fall out of the sky, for example, and it can be charted to, the agent has caused that. And we're thinking of law as this device for apportioning responsibility. What do you think might happen in the discourse of law when it has to engage with a form of intelligence which has created an outcome or assisted to create an outcome, and how it might deal with that when, of course, it's a non-human intelligence, and how that might kind of run up against other kind of ways of distributing responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty fruitful question to discuss, which could take a while, but maybe just a couple of highlights. So, you said first, like law, I mean, in many ways, law as a discursive form encodes capital or whatever the dominant power relations are, but it does have much more open discursive possibilities, of course, because we have this idea of the rule of law and democracy, which means that it constantly has to legitimate itself by enabling, for example, if the plane fell out of the sky because the AI system made a mistake, people would sue, and that's a democratic agonistic possibility to change the way we talk about responsibility and allocate liability and so on, which can change things. And there's other ways as well, but that's probably, as a lawyer, my favorite. And so we have colleagues, obviously this question then of how do we get at responsibility when we've got this sort of, so-called agentic system is a really critical question that various colleagues are working on. I'm working on it in relation to social media algorithmic systems that allocate harmful flows of advertising, for example. I personally think that we're already struggling with this question when it comes to corporations, which are legal persons that are quite complex, opaque, and so on. And this is like, well, so I showed the logarithmic scale. So this AI is then the logarithmic scale of that, in a sense of how much more difficult that's going to be to deal with. But I think some of the ideas that we've talked about but not really implemented effectively in relation to liability, responsibility of corporations and the humans and the subgroups of humans within corporations that make decisions will be applicable. So one colleague has tried to really sort of conceptualize this idea of systems intentionality, that the way that you set up a system, whether it's an AI system or a system of rewards and performance measures and so on within a corporation, that will create, drivers towards certain outcomes. So I can talk more about like the ad tech system, the way the auction works, the way that who's allowed to sell advertising, who's blocked from selling advertising, how the data gets used to target people and so on. We can't pinpoint a human who made a particular decision to give all those alcohol ads or gambling ads to the young man, but we can say that humans have responsibility for having set up essentially a business ecosystem that inevitably is going to produce a certain outcome in certain situations. So I think that's an important way to go, and also recognizing that you can make both systems, corporations as a whole, and the people who are meant to be in charge, the CEO, the board of directors, and the manager or employee who made the decision, like recognizing that you can have multiple liability distributed across actors you know, it's not one or the other. We often end up getting into that binary. So yeah, there's some of the thoughts I have, but I have some wonderful colleagues also working on this, like Henry Fraser at QUT and others.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Russell.
Thanks for the great talk, both of you. Mine kind of tacks onto Theo's about fragility, my question. So the fragility, these data centers would have to be fortresses because they look kind of fragile to me. And that relates to the other kind of fragility here, which is investment. So one of the popular anti-AI narratives is that this is hype, that the investment in it could collapse as soon as people start to think that these things don't really work. And what are the consequences for that, considering we've had previous versions of this, like blockchain and I guess big data and MOOCs and things like this. What's the relationship between these things and this? How is AI different? Is it just another hyped investment bubble, or is it something kind of different, do you think?
That's a really good question, Russell. Thanks. I think in some ways, I would say it's kind of the latest of these kind of digital hype cycles, and we have seen a number of them. Whether it's a kind of bubble that goes the way of the dot-com crash in the late 90s, when trillions were wiped off of the financial values of companies and enormous numbers of startups went bust, or whether it's more like what we saw with the rise of social media and other Web 2 platforms in the mid-2000s, I think is hard to say. From an environmental perspective, if it was a bubble that collapsed, that would almost certainly be a good thing, because the stuff that got left would be the relatively low power consuming, like climate tech around modeling, around smart grids, around smart thermometers, where we can say, well, that stuff does actually have noticeable benefits and requires very little material to actually run. And I think it is important to note, with a lot of like the corporate text producing, image producing, video producing tech at the moment, none of it really makes money. They're at the stage where they've got enormous amounts of venture capital funding that they are currently burning through as they try to get an enormous user base. And then they will kind of monetize that system later through the kind of process that Cory Doctorow talks about in terms of enshittification. So how are they going to make the service worse so that they can make money out of it, in a similar way that we've seen with things like Facebook and YouTube, where 20 years ago, they were a deal that was far too good to be true for end users, because that was never like a viable long-term strategy. And some of the stuff around AI is like, well, we'll sell subscriptions to it. Currently, the highest tier of ChatGPT Pro users, which I think is $200 a month per seat, they lose money on, because that involves unlimited text to video generation, and the amount of energy that uses, even though OpenAI are paying a discounted rate for that energy, still means it's a money loser. So and I can see Leon's question about, have we already started seeing enshittification with ChatGPT 5, and possibly is the answer. So I think it is a space that we need to be watching of and quite wary of, in terms of the fact that the business models underpinning it at the moment clearly are not sustainable, in a similar way that the environmental costs that underpin this are very much going in an unsustainable direction.
If I may add, I think I agree with everything Sai said, of course, but I think there may also be an element where the question should be asked the other way around. So we're sort of seeing the AI hype driving investment in data centers and into electricity generation that maybe is capitalistically needed for growth. So in a way, AI hype becomes a way to convert venture capital into greater spending on material infrastructure in terms of those data centers, that the use of which is perhaps not entirely clear. And all the big tech companies are investing heavily into the power generation grids. And another of my colleagues, Jathan Sadowski, has argued that the only business model for AI at the moment is with two industries, namely the military industry and the fossil fuel extraction industry. And there is certainly huge partnerships with both of those and some really, really scary things happening. And then, you know, as with many other things in our current consumer capitalist life, the stuff that gets developed for those uses ends up, you know, there end up being consumer mass consumption applications, but they weren't, that wasn't where the funding and the impetus came to develop those things. Anyway, just to end on a cheerful note.
Thank you. Sam Ross asked a question in the chat, just very related to, Christine, what you were, your last slide there about, should we be using AI as individuals versus, we're talking about critiques of corporations, and you talked about the shifting of responsibility. I don't know if either of you want to respond to that question, since in a university space, right, our students are asking us these questions, our colleagues are. What about individuals? What's your perspective?
I feel kind of agnostic on the question, because I think for me it really depends what kind of AI are we talking about. And it's something that as an academic who teaches media studies and media production, I kind of speak to with my students in terms of like, well, if we were going to say no AI at all, you can't use a smartphone to take any pictures. And if you've got an interchangeable lens camera, you've got to turn your autofocus off because that's AI. And if you want to reduce the noise on photographs that you take, you would have to be very careful about which algorithm you choose, which is just like, do I use this slider or this slider? They look like they do the same thing. One uses AI, one doesn't. So there's a whole bunch of that stuff where I feel like it's quite hard to say, like, no, we shouldn't be using AI, but that's quite different, I would argue, to some of the like text to video, image generation, and kind of chat GPT chatbot type stuff, where I would say, as and where we can, while recognizing that people always talk about this like in terms of as consumers, but often like as laborers and as workers, we don't get to choose what computers we use, what software we use, and what algorithms underpins the operation of those tools. So I'm always a bit wary of trying to pin things on individuals.